Hi everyone, cool me down, Tano here, the internet's, it's hot out. Phoebe Bridgers' Lost Weekend. Here we have the third and latest full-length LP from singer-songwriter Miss Phoebe Bridgers. Really the crowned queen of the indie circuit these days, especially with this album on track to do over 100K first week while being released through Dead Oceans. And I also count myself among those who have purchased the album, though I will say I haven't always been in the tank for Phoebe, because when she initially debuted in the late 2010s, there wasn't really a whole lot about her that stood out to me. Not after years of artists like Angel Olsen, Sharon Van Etten, and even boy genius collaborator Julian Baker having already kind of made waves in a similarly moody indie folk and rock lane. But Phoebe started to quickly come into her own as a songwriter, as a lyricist, and working out the kinks in how to present herself more effectively to the world. And I think a vital part of that was playing more into her influences, not only broadcasting a deep love for the music of Elliott Smith, but also collaborating for an entire record with one of her musical heroes, Mr. Bright Eyes himself, Conor Oberst, in their kind of one-off duo Better Oblivion Community Center album. And while her detractors might argue that her songs don't really live up to the bar set by such songwriting giants, they were certainly having an effect similar to that of a classic Smith ballad when you look at the impact they were having on her fans. And at that time, it didn't seem like there was any other songwriter on the indie scene at the moment who was better set to kind of carry the torch. Phoebe was clearly that girl, not only to many of the songwriters who came before her, but a lot of her contemporaries too, who over the years have been eager to shout her out and collaborate with her again and again, whether it's the beloved boy genius trio featuring Lucy Dacus and Julian Baker, who I mentioned earlier, or Phoebe getting the chance to open up for none other than Taylor Swift, which is just a massive bump for an artist of Phoebe's size. And look, the praise Phoebe has been receiving over the years was certainly warranted, especially around the release of her second album, Punisher, which is pretty much the record where I saw the light personally, as this thing was an improvement on all fronts, even if many of the instrumentals ran a little bland or generic. Still, the vocals and the lyrics, the songwriting were there, as Phoebe continued to define what made her different from others in her lane. But fans have been waiting for a minute for the Punisher follow-up. I mean, of course, there was that pretty well-celebrated boy genius record, aptly titled The Record, but for Phoebe personally, solo-wise, things have been very quiet on the album front until now, as we received a quick announcement and then suddenly teasers very quickly this year. It was also revealed that this record featured a really beefy track list of 16 songs and a line of collaborators that goes for miles and sports legendary names from acts such as Godflesh, Yeah Yeah Yeahs, as well as American football. Also new faces on the scene that have won the hearts and minds of many underground music listeners these days, be it either Isaac Wood or Cameron Winter, Alex G, Jack Antonoff, whose production these days seems to concern some, had a lot of input into this album as well, seemingly. Lucy Dacus and Julian Baker are in the mix too, because why wouldn't they be? As well as Christian Lee Hudson, who is somebody who Phoebe has been working with for a while. So just the amount of guests on this record is massive, and the sound of Lost Weekend is huge. It really matches it. I mean, this record from the outset looks like an experience, and believe me, it is, as I think this thing is handily her best and most ambitious release to date, her most emotionally impactful with passionate vocal performances, biting lyrics, a wide range of feelings and sounds, and some strangely unique production too, which is made apparent by the opening track, The Outside, a song that features eerie drones and leans very heavily into these vocoder vocal passages. There's almost a Laurie Anderson vibe to it in terms of its stillness and very intense, odd intimacy, as Phoebe's lyrics throw out these weirdly violent and scary moments, flashes references that don't dig into these references so much to where you get a clear idea, but it's just enough to where it has that shock of emotion to it, which I think is part of what makes this song a perfect tone setter. Then immediately after this, we blast into Lost Boys, which was the lead single to the record. It is the fullest, warmest, and hookiest Phoebe song ever, I would say, and brings the momentum of the album to a high point right at the beginning, with big horn sections, lots of layers, a sing-along chorus, and a very clear message in terms of men being in this stage of arrested development and immaturity and the kind of dangerous and chaotic romances that the protagonist of the song is having with these men. It's a fiery one for sure, and immediately after this, we are hit with Kill Me, which instantly turns the record cold. The space and the darkness surrounding this track sonically is much more typical Phoebe Bridgers, but those elements are just multiplied by 5, 6, 7 times in terms of intensity. There's a wintry, hypnotizing aura about this song that kind of makes the world feel like it has stopped while I'm listening to it. The instrumental palette on this song is so surreal and shadowy too, and Phoebe's voice locked into it comes across like that scared inner voice that kind of eats away at your head when you're most afraid, which is eventually contrasted with a very kind of freeing, triumphant finish where it seems like the narrator of the song is kind of overcoming that fear and embracing desire. Then Governor's Waltz to follow is a little tune in 3/4 and has to be maybe some of the most like prominent influence from Conor Oberst we've heard on any Phoebe track, from the chord progression to the quiver in her voice to the lyrics. I was the belle at the governor's ball, hiding in the bathroom like Shelley Duvall. You had a nosebleed, you were in my way, and you didn't remind me of anything. So let's see how long we can go without touching. Why don't you sing me to sleep? I know you never actually think about jumping, but do it for me. There's something about this writing that is so bittersweet. It's cutting, it's funny, it's snarky, and clearly Phoebe isn't afraid to get a little bit mean and critical in the short final verse too. Also, I love the way the instrumental shifts and changes to match the storyline in the song as well, from like some, background noise and what sounds like these distant kind of muted kick drums. There's something like about it that reminds me of the theatrics of a record like Lifted, once more showcasing that Bright Eyes influence. And then after this we have Bobby, which is a full-throated love song that is so loud, so fiery, with plucky acoustic, roaring, rocking layers, shouty lead vocals too. It's bright, it's fun, it's hopeful. We should all be so lucky to have someone at some point in our lives who thinks of us in the way that Phoebe writes about her muse on this song. Even if the line, and if you didn't like either one of my friends, I'd kill them, I'd kill them, is hilariously a bit much. But yeah, there's also parts of this track that remind me of an old David Berman Purple Mountains lyric that haunts me to this day. It goes something like, the end of all wanting is all that I've been wanting, which inadvertently or not, Phoebe kind of matches with Bobby. This could be the end of all wanting, offloading that into a mantra toward the end of the song. This could be the end, this could be the end. But yeah, it's a beautiful sentiment in terms of it being about a relationship that is so fulfilling that you thirst for nothing else. Now, just to do a check-in on the track list here, in my opinion, everything up until this point has been perfect. This is like a perfect first leg of a record. Just what a run of tracks. And believe it or not, in my opinion, the run continues. You have the title track, which is equal parts haunting and surprising, with droning organ chords, just pin drop quiet lead vocals, where Phoebe kind of goes through this inner monologue where she's contrasting these different moments before and after the fame, giving us a snapshot of these more carefree experiences where she's kind of just existing and being in love, having connections, which is kind of contrasted with the ways in which her rise in the music world has kind of put a monkey wrench in various plans or just the original pathway of her life. And this in and of itself is an interesting progression to be had, but then the track suddenly shifts into this very explosive indie-tronic outro that, once again, I can't help but be reminded of a Bright Eyes record, like, you know, from the Digital Ash era. It's like that kind of busy and bustling and chaotic, but honestly, actually good, because you know, that is famously not the best Bright Eyes album, but I can kind of hear like that distant influence in it. The song Haunted is another interesting tone shift because it's a very hopeful and bright indie folk ballad with some warm and wonderful string work with vocal lines that have kind of a traditional flair to them. It reminds me of the first inklings of this sound in, you know, the 2000s, or just really how this genre sounded before it got, you know, kind of put into drug commercials and bullshit like that. But yeah, I love the progression of this track too, as well as the performance. The driving kicks that kind of pick the whole thing up around the midpoint are great. And this track has to feature one of the most animated and amped up vocal performances Phoebe has ever put down too. Again, it's just amazing to hear such a range from her on this album, to hear her dig deep into these just dark subterranean moods that are just sub-zero temperature, and then also jump to these moments that are so feel-good and so infectious, intoxicating even in their positive outlook, especially with closing lines. You won't have to open a heart that's broken, water's gonna flow in either way, and then my heart is growing either way, although when she's performing it, it does kind of sound like my heart is rowing either way, which would make sense to me with the water flowing. A lot of places online are saying that's not the lyric, but like, I like to pretend it is. And then after this panorama, kind of contributing to the flow of the record in an interesting way, is almost like this instrumental afterthought that is outside of its kind of a ghostly little outro where you do get some lyrics. A panorama hotel room, I chose this number for the view, bags exploded all over the floor, and someone's at the door. If you're drinking, then I'm drinking. Which I think does denote like a tone shift in terms of like letting a certain person into the conversation or into the narrative of this record, or, you know, certain feelings that maybe weren't being addressed up until this point. It's with respect to this, I think this record works in two halves in a way. I do feel like this track is a breaking point and introduces just another side of the record, a side that maybe almost mirrors the first half slightly, because Still Standing does have a very strange alien quality to it, just like The Outside does. Again, there's a stillness here with these warm, sliding, droning synth passages, and Phoebe's vocals, while yeah, they're not laid out with vocoder, they do feel strangely so close and so quiet and so beautiful and uncomfortable all at once, which is a quality this track maintains even as acoustics take over the instrumental. And this song emotionally just is searing. It just feels so hot to the touch as Phoebe is wrestling with these feelings around her father that are wrapped up in kind of a longing, a love for him, but also just a lot of trauma and pain and hurt over past events and experiences. And I presume, just given the state of the writing, just the fraught nature of the relationship as she kind of switches back and forth between wanting him or not wanting him in her life. And to hear her wrestle with these feelings so genuinely and so sincerely makes for one of the most heart-wrenching spots on the record. And just like following The Outside, the momentum does pick up once again with Liberty Tree, but the weird uncanny feeling that starts to seep in with Still Standing continues, as this track's instrumentation does feel a bit folksier, yes, but there's something kind of off about it. The instrumental and the beats feel very rigid, and Phoebe's vocals have this kind of ghostly chorus effect surrounding them that's impossible to ignore. And as more layers seep in between these beats and piano sections, they're EQ'd and warped in such a way to where they feel very muddy, but also very intensely close. And the thing is, like, singer-songwriter records are just not mixed this way. But there's something about it that feels very intentional, because it does create this genuinely nightmarish vibe. Almost like the songs in the second half of the record are being performed by a bunch of paralysis demons. The song Never Going Back continues this very similar feeling as well, with how loud and jarring the dynamics are, how aggressively blown out the acoustic guitar feels, and also how repetitive and straightforward the message is as well, in terms of not being able to relive the past and having to move on despite maybe certain mixed feelings and life pushing you in whatever direction it is. Then Other Plans is another also very brief-ish moment on the record that, yes, yes, while I'm not crazy about the structure on this track, I have to say I do admire the very clear Daniel Johnston influence on this one. Like, you can't tell me the chords and the simplicity and Phoebe's vocal lines don't feel pulled in a way like from one of his early tapes. Then after this we had the Lost Parade interlude, which is a kind of short and very dodgy instrumental. And while yes, I still do think the second half of this record mirrors the first at least somewhat, still this portion of the record is peppered with all of these intensely dark, tortured feelings and experiences around family, around a harrowing past, but structurally these tracks increasingly just get more and more fragmented and raw and not anywhere near as polished as almost anything you're hearing in the first half of the album. And again, for all of these moments to land in a very focused way in the second half of the record, I think says something in terms of like the feelings and emotions informing the start as opposed to the end of this album. So while I do think this makes the second half of the record's flow like a little bit choppy and, you know, some of the song structures a little kind of underwhelming, I do think the record has a very strong finish. The song I Can't Wait is kind of like a very slow burning, simmering rocker, kind of the rocker of the second half that builds up a lot of tension over a long period of time before it transitions into tender acoustics and eventually giving way to these booming drums and claustrophobic layers of bass and guitar. Once again, it's a sound on the album that is kind of muffled, but it's still very intense. And then As Above is maybe just about as explosive and as powerful moment you could ask for from a full final song on an album, because after this you kind of have the title track Reprise, which also ends things off on a very interesting note. But on this track you have these massive orchestrations which again come across very ghostly and fragmented, almost like they kind of appear out of thin air when they are introduced into the track. Phoebe screaming her brains out. She sounds almost Björk-ish during certain portions of the song. Some organs as well, captivating chord changes. Like, this portion of the record is just so intense and so layered and so versatile, and lyrically, along with the reprise, like ties up a lot of the main feelings and emotions of this record so well, which again I think speaks to Phoebe's lyrical improvements from Punisher to this record, to approach her writing in such a macro way across this track list, across these two different halves of the album, which take on different sort of feelings and different themes and emotional angles. But yeah, I gotta say, this record is a seriously powerful and incredible LP, one of the best I've heard this year, one of the best I've heard this decade on the singer-songwriter front, and is Phoebe at her most ambitious and fully formed. Again, there are moments in the second half that I was wanting maybe just like a little bit more from in terms of structure and detail. But with that being said, I'm very much blown away by what this album has to offer, without question, which is why I'm feeling a decent 2 strong 9 on this one. Transition, have you given this record a listen? Did you love it? Did you hate it? What would you rate it? You're the best, you're the best. What should I review next? Hit the like if you like. Please subscribe and please don't cry. Hit the bell as well. Over here next to my head is another video you can check out. Hit that up or a link to subscribe to the channel. Anthony Fantano, Phoebe Bridgers, forever.